She had 27 coins. That's what it came down to. 27 coins, 2 diapers, a nearly empty bottle of water, and a baby pressed against her chest who didn't know the world had just turned its back on them. The eviction came quietly. No shouting, no last-minute appeals. Just a folded paper under the door. And then hours of silence as she sat on the floor beside the crib, her mind moving too slowly to process what was next. The landlord had been patient more than most would be. But patience doesn't feed ledgers, and mercy doesn't pay bills. So when the locks changed, no one came to stop it. No one asked where she would go. She didn't even know herself. She waited outside the building for almost 2 hours, sitting on a plastic bag that held the last of her belongings. No one offered help. No one stopped. Her phone had been off for days. She didn't call anyone, because there was no one to call. Friends had drifted off when she stopped replying. Family had become strangers long before her son was born. And the father, well, he had vanished the moment the word pregnant left her lips. The only constant was the child in her arms, barely 4 months old, whose only need was closeness and warmth. She had nothing else to give, but she would give him that until the end. At the bus station, she stood in front of the ticket counter with her handful of coins, not even sure why she was there. The woman behind the glass didn't ask many questions. Maybe she had seen enough like her to know what was happening. With quiet eyes and a tired voice, she offered the cheapest ticket headed anywhere outside the city. It was a night route to a small city 3 hours away, leaving in 15 minutes. The mother nodded. She didn't care where it went. It wasn't here. That was enough. The rain started as she boarded the bus. She pressed her baby against her chest under her worn coat, shielding him as best she could from the wet wind. The driver, Russ, didn't look at her. The other passengers gave her space without needing to be asked. She wasn't sure if that was kindness or fear of the smell clinging to her clothes, or maybe just the instinctive discomfort people feel when they see someone who has lost everything. The ride was long, not in distance, but in weight. The baby whimpered in his sleep, then cried, then fell silent again. She rocked him, humming into his tiny ear, her voice breaking with exhaustion. Her body ached from carrying too much for too long. Every bump in the road echoed through her spine. Her breast was sore and she could feel her milk thinning. She hadn't eaten properly in days, but she still offered it to him because it was the only thing she had. Outside, the lights of the highway slipped past the fogged window like ghosts. The rain tapped against the glass like a second heartbeat. She didn't close her eyes. She was afraid that if she did, she might not open them again. She kept thinking about the moment she had zipped up the bag, leaving behind everything that couldn't fit. The picture frames, the baby blanket from the hospital, her own shoes. She had walked to the station in sandals soaked through with cold water, the soles peeling. But she had carried her son the entire way, wrapped in the one dry towel they had left. When the bus finally pulled into the terminal, it was past midnight. Most of the city was asleep. The station lights flickered with a pale yellow glow, casting shadows that stretched like limbs across the floor. She stepped off the bus into the wet air and looked around. There were no signs, no faces she recognized, just the hollow quiet of a place that didn't care she was there. She walked through the terminal slowly, unsure where to go. The baby stirred and whimpered, and she kissed his forehead and whispered that it was okay, even though she didn't believe it. There were no benches without metal arms dividing them, no corners that felt safe enough to stop and rest. She found the women's bathroom and slipped inside, locking herself in the furthest stall. It was clean enough, cold, but dry. She sat on the toilet lid with the baby in her lap, unzipped her coat and fed him in silence. Her skin was pale and clammy. She could hear the murmur of a distant cleaner dragging a mop down the hall, but no one came in. No one checked. When he finished nursing, she wrapped him tighter in the towel and placed her own sweater over his legs. He was warm. That was all. That mattered. She leaned her head back against the tiled wall and stared up at the ceiling. For a long time, she didn't cry. There were no tears left, just the quiet horror of not knowing what tomorrow would be, and the deeper terror that it might not come. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to pause, just long enough to remind herself that she had survived one more day. And if she could survive one more, maybe, just maybe, she could survive the next. Morning came not with light, but with movement. The first flush of footsteps echoed through the terminal as early travelers arrived, dragging bags, sipping coffee, talking softly into phones. She woke not from sleep, but from a shallow state of half-consciousness, her body stiff from hours spent motionless on a toilet seat, her arms aching from cradling her baby without rest. Her legs tingled as if they had forgotten how to stand. The baby stirred. He was hungry again. She fed him in silence, listening to the steady drip of water from the sink nearby. When she emerged from the stall, the bathroom was empty. The mirror, above the sinks, cracked in the corner. She didn't look at her reflection. Outside, the air was sharp with the smell of wet asphalt and overcooked cafeteria eggs. She walked slowly through the station, her coat still damp from the night before. No one looked at her. That was the strangest part of it all. How invisible she felt, as if she had stepped out of the world entirely. Not a person, but a shadow drifting through public space, tolerated only as long as she didn't make noise. She found a vending machine and stared at the food behind the glass. Nothing but candy and soda and overpriced sandwiches. She had no coins left, not even one. She asked a woman at the information desk if there were any shelters nearby. The woman barely lifted her head. Her fingers tapped on the keyboard for a moment before she slid a post-it note across the counter with a list of 3 addresses, none of which meant anything to her. The mother asked if they were close, and the woman only said, "Bus line 6. That was all. No directions, no explanation. She nodded and thanked her anyway. She walked out into the street, holding the baby close, trying to understand the bus routes printed on a cracked plastic sign. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained thick and gray, like they were pressing down on the whole city. Her sandals slipped on the wet pavement. Every few minutes, she had to stop to readjust the baby, whose body was growing heavier with each hour. He cried now more often, not just from hunger, but from discomfort and confusion. She bounced him, gently, as she waited for the bus, afraid of standing still for too long, afraid someone might tell her to move along. The first shelter was full. The receptionist didn't look surprised. She said, "We've been over capacity for weeks. You can try again tomorrow." When the mother asked if she could just sit in the lobby for a while to rest, the woman hesitated, then shook her head. "We can't. I'm sorry. We're not allowed." That phrase echoed in her ears as she stepped back into the cold. "We're not allowed." As if kindness had rules now. The second shelter was a church basement on the edge of the city. It took her over an hour to reach it, walking half the distance when the connecting bus never came. She knocked gently, unsure if she had even found the right place. A man opened the door but didn't smile. "You're not on the list," he said. She asked how to get on it, and he told her there was a waiting period, paperwork, a process. She asked where she could wait in the meantime. He looked over her shoulder as if searching for a way to end the conversation, then said, "I don't know. Maybe try the library. They're warm." Then he closed the door. By late afternoon, her arms were trembling from holding the baby so long without a break. Her back burned. Her lips were dry. She found a water fountain in a park and drank as much as she could, then soaked the corner of the towel to wipe the baby's face. He was crying again. The sound cut through the quiet park, and people began to glance in her direction. She stood quickly and kept walking. The third address wasn't a shelter at all. It was a government office with locked glass doors and a sign that read, "Housing applications, open Mondays and Thursdays." It was Wednesday. Through the glass, she could see a woman in an office looking at a screen. She knocked softly. then louder. The woman looked up, frowned, and waved her hand like she was swatting away a fly. She mouthed the words, "Come back tomorrow," then turned away. It was already getting dark. She had no place to go, no food, no change of clothes. The baby hadn't had a clean diaper since morning. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, her mind blank. Not thinking, not deciding, just waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. As the wind picked up again, she made her way back to the bus station. The bathrooms were still unlocked. She chose a different stall this time, further from the door, and slid the lock into place. She took off her coat and wrapped the baby in it, then sat on the floor, pressing her back to the wall. She rocked him slowly, whispering things she didn't even understand herself, just noise to soothe him, to soothe herself. Outside people were coming and going, laughing, shouting, living. Inside the tiled walls, she sat alone in silence. She had knocked on every door. She had followed every lead. There was nothing left to ask for. The child had fallen asleep against her chest again, his small breaths warm and soft. She held him tighter and closed her eyes. In the darkness of the stall, she made a quiet vow. If this was what survival looked like, she would bear it. Even if no one saw her, even if no one came. As long as he was breathing, she would stay. Time didn't pass normally inside that bathroom. There were no clocks, no sunlight, no voices calling her name. Only the stale air, the low mechanical hum of the terminal, and the rhythmic creak of the door swinging open and shut as strangers came and went, never noticing the last stall was occupied by someone trying to stay invisible. It didn't feel like a place meant for sleeping, but she had stopped thinking in terms of places. There was no home. There was only the floor beneath her and the warmth of her child on her chest. She started to measure time in diapers, the clean. Ones ran out on the third morning. After that, she did what she could, using a t-shirt from her bag and rinsing it in the sink when no one was around. The smell lingered, and she hated herself for it, not because she blamed her child, but because she had nothing better to offer. She watched him more closely now. Every time he cried, she felt panic tighten in her throat. Was it hunger? Pain? Cold? She could no longer tell. Her instincts had dulled, worn down by exhaustion and the quiet horror of pretending this was okay. She left the bathroom in short bursts, wrapped the baby tight, and moved through the terminal like a ghost. Sometimes she'd sit in the food court just long enough to feel heat on her face from a nearby oven, pretending she was waiting for someone. She stared at the half-eaten meals on abandoned trays, never quite able to bring herself to take one. But one night, when the hunger got too loud, she did. A man had left a sandwich, half wrapped in paper, untouched. She waited 10 minutes to be sure he wasn't coming back. Then she took it, walked quickly back to the bathroom, locked the door, and ate it in the dark. She gave the baby water first and then offered her breast. The milk was still coming, but less, thinner. He fussed more at each feeding now, growing frustrated, biting down, pulling away. Her body was shutting down, and she knew it. Her reflection in the mirror started to change. Her face grew pale and, drawn, her cheeks hollow. Her eyes looked too large for her face. The bruises under them never faded. Her skin had the sheen of someone constantly damp. Sweat, milk, moisture from the cold concrete. Her wrists ached. Her legs twitched when she tried to sleep. But what she remembered most was the smell, the sour scent of old clothes, old milk, and her own fear. It clung to her no matter how many paper towels she used to wipe herself clean. She cried once, quietly, into her sleeve, not because of the smell itself, but because it was her baby's world now. This space, this stench, this silence. She stopped asking for help. Something inside her shifted the day a guard asked her to move along from a bench she'd sat on for only 5 minutes. He didn't yell, just looked down at her with a professional coldness and said, "You can't stay here, ma'am." She nodded, didn't argue, and returned to the bathroom stall without a word. After that, she spoke less, asked for nothing, just survived in fragments. Sometimes she'd imagine someone seeing her. Not a rescue, not a miracle, just someone who actually saw her, saw the baby's flushed cheeks, the way his clothes no longer fit, how thin he was becoming. She imagined a stranger saying, "You shouldn't be here," but with concern instead of suspicion. But that never happened. People looked past her, around her, through her. She wasn't a mother anymore, not in their eyes, just a problem they didn't want to think about. She began to hallucinate lightly, though she didn't realize that's what it was at first. On the fifth night, while feeding her son, she thought she heard her mother's voice in the hallway. She stood, holding the baby, trembling, listening, but the voice was gone. Another night, she thought she saw a hand reach under the stall, offering her something wrapped in cloth. But it was just a cleaning rag left behind by a janitor. The lines between waking and dreaming blurred. She told herself it didn't matter. The baby was still breathing. That was the line. As long as he was breathing, she had not yet failed. By now her body had gone into a kind of quiet panic. Her stomach twisted with cramps. Her breasts were swollen, but the milk was too thin to satisfy. She drank water constantly to try to keep it flowing. She even drank from the mop sink once, late at night when the hallway was dark and she was too dizzy to walk far. The cold water stung her teeth, but it helped, briefly. When she nursed him that night, he latched, suckled, cried, then latched. Again. She whispered, I know, I'm sorry," over and over, as if saying it enough might turn the water in her body into something more. At some point, she lost count of the days. The baby no longer cried as often. That scared her, more than the noise had. He was quieter now, sleepier. She tried to convince herself it was rest, that he was just crowing. But she knew better. Babies don't sleep this much unless something is wrong. One morning, she stood up too fast and fell against the wall. Her vision went black for a moment. When it came back, the world looked tilted. She sat down again, clutching her baby tight, breathing shallow. Her heart felt like it was beating through molasses. She closed her eyes and told herself to hold on just a little longer, just until someone noticed, just until her body made more milk, just until something changed, but nothing changed. And in that stall, she began to wonder how long a person could live like this. How many nights in silence? How many days without food? How many times you could lie to your baby saying everything was okay, when all you were doing was keeping him warm in a place no child should ever be. It happened early. Too early for most of the terminal's shops to be open. The kind of hour where light still feels artificial and silence holds the weight of something waiting to be broken. The bathroom was dim, the overhead bulbs flickering in and out of rhythm, one of them buzzing faintly above her. She had not slept, not really, not in the way a body needs. She had rested with her back against the wall, her baby curled against her chest, but the sleep had never come. Only the drifting, that strange half-world where thoughts slip in and out, where time folds over itself, where the body begins to forget its purpose. She knew before she opened her eyes that something inside her had shifted. Her fingers were too stiff to move. Her legs felt thick like soaked cloth. Her mouth was dry and sour, her skin clammy despite the chill. She tried to lift her arm and couldn't. The baby stirred in her lap, and that was what forced her awake. She blinked slowly, tried to move again, and managed only to lean forward slightly before her arms gave out. Her forehead touched the cold tile wall, and she stayed there, breathing in sharp, shallow pulls, panic inching its way up her throat. The baby began to cry, a soft, tired cry that barely echoed off the walls. She tried to answer him, but her voice came out cracked and broken. Her milk had all but disappeared. She had tried to feed him the night before, but he had pulled away after only a few seconds, wailing with frustration. She had rocked him for hours afterward, whispering lies in a soft, desperate rhythm. Almost, baby, almost tomorrow. I'll find something, I promise. Just sleep. Please sleep. She tried to stand, but couldn't. Her knees buckled. Her vision pulsed. She felt herself sink back down to the floor, her cheek pressed to the cold ceramic, the baby still on her chest, still crying. And in that moment, something terrifying happened. She didn't feel afraid. Not of dying, not of falling unconscious, only of him being alone if it happened, only of his little voice echoing out into an empty hallway unheard. That's when the door opened. There were footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and the sound of keys jingling. A man's voice called out. Annoyed, not yet alarmed, he knocked once, on the stall door, then again, harder. "Cleaning," he said. "This one's been locked all night." When she didn't answer, he paused. She heard the ring of a master key turning the lock, the click of the handle, and then a moment of stillness as the door opened. What he saw wasn't dramatic. There was no blood, no screams. Just a woman slumped on the bathroom floor, her arms curled protectively around a baby whose face was wet with tears, both of them wrapped in mismatched layers of fabric, unmoving. She was still breathing, barely. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The baby let out a sudden, sharp cry as the cold air rushed in, and that sound, raw and high, snapped the man out of whatever daze he had fallen into. He didn't know what to do. He dropped his mop, pulled out his phone, and started dialing, stumbling over his own words. "There's a woman. She's got a baby. I think she's not okay. She's not answering me." The ambulance came faster than expected. The bathroom was closed off. No one knew who she was, no name, no ID, no emergency contact. The nurse asked if she was homeless. The janitor just shrugged and said, "She was here for days. I thought she was waiting for someone." They carried her out on a stretcher, her arms still curled protectively around the baby. He was taken separately, bundled by a different pair of hands. That separation broke through the haze. Her eyes flew open, panic flooding in. She tried to speak, to reach for him, but her voice was gone. She managed only a whisper, one word, again and again, her lips barely forming the sound. "Please." At the hospital, everything moved quickly and impersonally. She was treated for dehydration, fatigue, borderline hypothermia. They ran tests, hooked her up to fluids, monitored her vitals. Nurses spoke over her, beside her, around her. None of them asked her name. None of them sat long enough to hear her story. She was given hospital socks, a paper gown, and instructions to rest. She didn't ask about her baby right away. Not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid of the answer. The silence in the room felt too heavy, but eventually one of the nurses came back, holding a chart, and said, "Your baby's stable. He's being monitored. He was hungry. He's sleeping now." The words hit her like a wave she hadn't braced for. She closed her eyes and finally let the tears come. Not from pain, not from guilt, just from release. Still, no one called her by name. Later, a doctor came in, middle-aged, rushed, clipboard in hand. He looked her over, the way someone might examine a car that had just barely avoided a wreck. He asked if she had family. She said no. He asked how long she had been without food. She didn't answer. He sighed, nodded like he'd heard that silence before, and told her someone from social work would be in touch. She didn't ask when. She didn't ask anything. She just closed her eyes again. The hospital bed was warm. The sheets were thin but clean. The ceiling above her was cracked in one corner. Machines beeped softly in the background. For the first time in days, she was horizontal, not pressed against cold tile, not sitting hunched and afraid, just lying there, still. Her body began to understand rest. Her mind tried to catch up. She didn't know where her baby was. Not the room, not the floor, just that he was somewhere in the building sleeping. She repeated that to herself in a whisper, until the exhaustion finally pulled her under like a tide too strong to resist. He was sleeping. He was warm. He was safe. She had made it that far, but deep down, she knew survival wasn't the end. It was only the pause before the next impossible decision. The room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that weighs heavy, but a fragile one, held together by the faint rhythm of machines and the occasional rustle of paper from the hallway. Morning light came in through a narrow window, the kind designed not for a view, but for ventilation and regulation. Still, it was sunlight, and for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt its warmth on her face. She didn't move. Her body was still sore, her muscles still recovering from the long descent into collapse. But she breathed deeply, slowly. The world had stopped spinning. The baby had been moved into a separate room in the pediatric wing, under observation. They had let her see him late the night before. A nurse had wheeled her through the corridor, quiet and slow, and when she saw him, bundled in a tiny hospital bassinet, sleeping peacefully, lips slightly parted, something inside her cracked wide open. He looked thinner, his cheeks weren't as full, but he was clean, warm, safe. She reached for his hand and placed her fingers in his tiny palm. He didn't wake, but he held on. And that was enough. She wasn't ready to ask what came next. The truth was, no one had told her. A social worker had stopped by briefly, introduced herself with a soft voice and tired eyes, then handed her a clipboard of forms she hadn't been able to process. There were boxes to check, questions about income, housing, employment. None of which applied to her. She had looked at the forms, then simply placed them on the tray beside her bed. The social worker hadn't pushed. Maybe she understood what kind of exhaustion this was. Not just physical, but the kind that leaves a person unable to even imagine a future. Later that day, a nurse came in to check her IV and sat quietly for a moment on the edge of the bed. She didn't ask questions, didn't bring charts. She just looked at her with a quiet kind of compassion, like someone who had seen stories like this before. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough to understand what kind of silence lived in the spaces people usually ignored. After a moment, the nurse took a small slip of paper from her pocket and handed it over without explanation. It wasn't official, just a scribbled note, a first name, a phone number, and one short sentence underneath. It's just a group of moms. No programs, no judgment. We help each other. The mother stared at the paper, confused. The nurse shrugged and said softly, "It's not much, but it helped me once." Then she stood, adjusted the blanket around her legs, and left the room. Nothing else was said. No promise, no pressure, just a window where before there had been none. She kept the paper in her palm for the rest of the day, folding and unfolding it, staring at the numbers, trying to decide whether it was real, whether it was worth the last thread of hope she hadn't already spent. The hospital couldn't keep her, they made that clear. Once her vitals were stable and the baby cleared for discharge, they would need the bed. Resources were limited. There were always others waiting. But they didn't rush her either. They fed her, gave her clean clothes, let her rest. It wasn't kindness in the way people imagine it, warm and embracing. It was survival kindness, quiet, efficient, enough to get her to the next step. She was released on a gray afternoon. They handed her a plastic bag with a few diapers, formula samples, and a clean blanket. The baby was dressed in donated clothes that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and unfamiliar homes. She held him tight against her chest and stepped out into the wind, blinking against the dull light. The city was still cold, still unfamiliar, but she no longer felt invisible. She didn't go back to the station, not even to say goodbye to the stall. She walked past it slowly, one step at a time, her legs still shaky but her grip on the child steady. The world didn't look any easier. No one stopped her in the street. No miracle arrived, but she had the slip of paper in her pocket. That was all she needed to keep walking. It took her nearly an hour to find the address. It wasn't a shelter, not officially. Just a low, rust-colored house on a quiet side street with a crooked mailbox and a small front step. She stood outside, the gate for a long time, unsure if she should knock. She looked down at her baby, now asleep again against her, and whispered, "One more try." Then she stepped forward. The door opened before she even raised her hand. A woman in a hoodie and sweatpants stood in the frame. She didn't smile right away. She just looked, really looked. And for the first time in weeks, the mother felt seen. Not judged, not pitied, just seen. The woman stepped aside and said softly, "You hungry?" She nodded. The woman gestured her inside. "He can sleep on the couch. There's always a spot." There was no paperwork, no process, just a small kitchen, the smell of soup, and two other women in the back, talking quietly while folding baby clothes. There were toys scattered across the floor, a whiteboard on the wall with phone numbers and first names written in different colors. The space was worn, cluttered, imperfect, but it was full of life. She didn't speak for the first few minutes, just sat at the kitchen table while someone poured her a bowl of soup and handed her a clean bottle for the baby. She watched as one of the women picked him up and cradled him like it was the most natural thing in the world. No questions, no fear, just a shared understanding that this was how they kept each other alive. Later that night, after her son had fallen asleep on a small mattress in the corner, and her own stomach was full for the first time in what felt like forever, she stepped into the narrow hallway and stood in front of a small window near the door. It was just a rectangle of scratched glass, overlooking a cracked sidewalk and a flickering street lamp. Nothing special, but to her it was more than a window. It was proof that even when the road ended, there were still places left to knock. Still doors that opened without condition. Still women, somewhere, who made space for each other in a world that rarely did. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, for the first time in too long, she wasn't alone. And that was enough.